I was sitting in a hallway outside courtroom 4B, with a folder shaking in my hands, 11 minutes away from either saving my mother's house or losing it forever. On the other side of those doors was my own brother, dressed like a stranger, waiting to hear a judge decide whether the will he'd produced 6 weeks after our mother died was legitimate, or whether I could prove, in front of our entire family, that he had manipulated the one thing she swore she would never sign. 3 months earlier, I buried her. 11 days after that, a lawyer I had never met called to tell me the house I had spent 2 years nursing her in no longer belonged to me at all. What I found in the 6 weeks between that phone call and this hallway is the reason my brother couldn't even look at me when he walked past. You have to understand something about my mother before I tell you what he did to her. Her name was Eleanor Whitman, and at 74, she was diagnosed with vascular dementia. I'm Claire, 41 years old, divorced, raising my 16-year-old daughter Maya on my own, and working 12-hour shifts as a hospice nurse at a hospital 40 minutes from my mother's house, outside Dayton, Ohio. When the diagnosis came, I didn't think twice. I gave notice at the hospital, moved into my mother's spare bedroom, and became her full-time caregiver. It cost me my salary, my retirement contributions, and most of what I had in savings. It never once felt like a sacrifice. My brother Derek was 38, a real estate broker 2 hours away in Columbus, and he had a gift for showing up exactly when it mattered least. He missed the Christmas Mom forgot my name for the first time. He missed her hip surgery entirely. He sent flowers instead of calling on her birthday, twice in a row. When I mentioned, as gently as I could, that I could use help with the overnight shifts, he told me I was being dramatic, that Mom was sharper than I gave her credit for. His wife, Vanessa, ran a home staging business, and she had opinions about that house long before anyone had died in it. This place would show so much better empty, she said once, standing in my mother's kitchen while Eleanor napped upstairs, like she was already measuring the drapes for a listing photo. Our father, Walter, had died 6 years earlier, and the two things he left behind were a modest, antique restoration shop in Kettering and a wife who missed him every single day. Derek used to call the shop basically a hobby that lost money. Mom kept the sign above the door lit anyway, every night, long after the shop stopped taking new clients. My ex-husband, Mark, thought I was making a mistake giving up my nursing salary to move in with her. You have a daughter to think about, he told me. I did think about her, thought about what I wanted Maya to learn about what family actually meant, especially when no one was around to give you credit for it. I told myself none of that mattered. I wasn't caring for my mother to be thanked, and I certainly wasn't doing it for a house. I was doing it because she was my mother, and because somebody had to hold her hand through the parts nobody puts in the brochures. The 2 a.m. confusion, the afternoons she cried because she couldn't picture her own husband's face anymore, the day she looked at me with total clarity and made me promise I would never let Derek take over if something happened to her. I promised. I meant every word of it. Some nights, driving home from a 12-hour shift straight into another overnight with her, I told myself that promise was the only inheritance that actually mattered. But I had no idea how bad it was about to get. The call came on a Tuesday in March, 11 days after the funeral. The man on the phone introduced himself as Gary Prentice, an estate attorney I had never spoken to in my life. He said he was executing my mother's will and asked if I could come to his office Thursday at 10. I actually laughed, because my mother's will had been drawn up 9 years earlier by our family lawyer, Mr. Halloran, and I had a copy sitting in a folder in my own car. This is a more recent document, Gary said carefully, dated January the 14th. January 14th, 6 weeks before she died. 6 weeks after her neurologist had written, in records I still have copies of, that Eleanor was experiencing significant impairment in decision-making capacity. I sat in Gary's office 2 days later while he read the new will out loud. The house, the savings account, just under $190,000. The inventory from my father's old antique shop, all of it to Derek. I got a single line, to my daughter Claire, the sum of $1, and my gratitude. I read that line 4 times, waiting for a second sentence that never came. 26 years of birthdays, every school play, every 2 a.m. The phone call asking if she'd taken her medication, reduced to a single dollar and 1 polite word. Derek sat across the table in a blazer I didn't recognize, and he wouldn't look at me. Vanessa did, though. She looked at me the way you look at something you've already priced. Don't make this ugly, Claire, Derek finally said. She told you what, exactly? I asked. In January, when she couldn't remember what day it was? She had good days, he said. You'd know that, if you weren't so exhausted all the time, playing the martyr. Something cracked open in my chest, right there in that office with its soft lighting and its box of tissues angled just for people like me. I thought about the promise I'd made her, that I would never let him take over. I thought about a hallway I didn't know yet, outside a courtroom I hadn't heard of, where I'd be standing 3 months later with a folder full of proof. But that day, in Gary Prentice's office, I didn't have a folder yet. I had a $1 bill, which Derek actually handed me on his way out, like a punchline. For old time's sake, he said, almost smiling. I didn't say a word back. I got in my car, sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, and then I called Mr. Rick Halloran, our old family lawyer, because something about that January date wasn't sitting right with me. He didn't remember drafting anything new. He didn't even remember Derek calling him. That doesn't sound like her at all, he said quietly. Let me make a few calls. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I moved out of my mother's house in April. 30 days they gave me. I packed 2 years of my life into a storage unit in Kettering and moved into my daughter's old bedroom at my ex-husband's place because I genuinely had nowhere else to go. 41 years old, sleeping on an air mattress in my own daughter's childhood bedroom. I'd quit my hospital job to care for my mother, and no one was rushing to hire a nurse who'd been out of the workforce for 2 years. My retirement account had a little over $4,000 in it. The storage unit smelled like cardboard and dust, and every box I taped shut felt like closing a door I never agreed to close. I lay awake most nights doing math that never worked. One evening, packing the last box from the hallway closet, I found something that didn't belong there. A real estate flyer. Glossy, professional, my mother's house, photographed, staged, listed, dated 4 months before she died. Derek's name wasn't on it. Vanessa's staging company was. A note was clipped to the back, in Vanessa's handwriting. Confirm listing once probate clears. Cash buyer already interested. $340K. No contingencies. 4 months before my mother died. You have to understand. I already knew Derek and Vanessa weren't warm people. I knew that going in. But even I didn't think they'd start shopping my dying mother's Langan's house while I was still giving her sponge baths, still reading her the same 3 chapters of her favorite novel every night, because it was the only thing that calmed her down. This was never grief for them. It was a transaction they had started planning before she was even gone. I sat on that air mattress and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry at the funeral, or the lawyer's office, or any of it. Quiet. Ugly. The kind of crying you only do once you understand you were the only one who ever really showed up. Maya found me like that, around midnight. She didn't say anything. She just sat down on the floor next to me and put her head on my shoulder, the same way I used to sit with my mother on her worst nights. I realized then, no one was coming to save me. I had to save myself. The next morning I called Mr. Halloran again, properly this time, and asked him to pull his old file. He remembered my mother well. He had drafted her original will 9 years earlier, and had never once received a request to change it. That was the first thread. I pulled every medical record I had, including the neurologist, capacity assessment from January 3rd. 11 days before the new will was supposedly signed. I found the notary's name printed at the bottom of the document, a man named Tom Reyes, and when I looked him up in the Ohio Secretary of State's public database, his notary commission had expired the previous November, 2 months before he supposedly watched my mother sign. Week by week, quietly, methodically, I built a folder. I got a signed statement from my mother's hospice chaplain, who had visited every week and who had written in his own private notes about a February conversation in which Eleanor asked him, confused and frightened, why the papers Derek brought didn't feel right to her. I kept the real estate flyer, time-stamped from Vanessa's own staging software. I hired an elder law attorney named Priya Nair, who took one look at the notary's expired commission and told me flatly, "This isn't a gray area, Claire. This is fraud." I also knocked on the Petrosky's door, our mother's neighbors for 11 years, and asked, carefully, if they remembered anything unusual in January. Mrs. Petrosky didn't hesitate. She remembered Derek's car in the driveway at odd hours that week, and a man she didn't recognize carrying a briefcase up the front steps on a Tuesday afternoon. The same Tuesday, it turned out, listed on the notarized document. For the first time in months, I felt something other than grief. It felt like solid ground under my feet again. Priya filed a formal will contest and requested an emergency probate hearing, citing lack of testamentary capacity and undue influence. Derek's attorney called it, in writing, Hadsid, a grieving daughter's attempt to relitigate her mother's wishes out of spite. He had no idea Priya had already subpoenaed the notary's commission records. He had no idea about the chaplain's notes. He had no idea I had spent 6 weeks building a case as carefully as I once tracked my mother's ENSA medication schedule. Because some things, I had learned, you only get one chance to get right. They had no idea what was coming. Which brings me back to that hallway outside courtroom 4B, 11 minutes before the hearing. My hands wrapped around a folder that had taken me 6 weeks and everything I had left to build. Derek walked past me into the courtroom without a word. Vanessa gave me a small, tight smile, the kind you give someone you've already forgotten. I sat down next to Priya at a table that suddenly felt too small for what was about to happen. Judge Alvarez called the case. Derek's attorney spoke first, confident, almost bored, describing a devoted son who had simply honored his mother's final, clear-eyed wishes. Derek nodded along like he actually believed it. Then Priya stood up. She opened a slim black folder of her own, mine, the one I had built for 6 weeks, and set it gently on the table, like she had all the time in the world. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She started with the neurologist. Report from January 3rd. Significant cognitive impairment, documented 11 days before the signing date. Then she introduced the notary's commission record, expired 2 months before the document was supposedly notarized. I watched Derek's attorney's face change. I watched Derek's face change faster. Objection. This is, his attorney started. This is a matter of public record, Your Honor, Priya said calmly, and kept going. She read the chaplain's notes into evidence. My mother's own words, frightened and confused, asking why the papers Derek brought didn't feel right. Then she held up the real estate flyer. 4 months before Eleanor died, Vanessa's staging company, a confirmed cash buyer, contingent on probate clearing, Priya read aloud, and the room went completely silent. Somewhere behind me, I heard my Aunt Carol whisper, "Oh my God," under her breath. Nobody else made a sound. I watched my brother's face go pale, then red, then something I had never once seen on him before. Afraid. His hands, folded so carefully on the table a moment earlier, curled into fists he didn't seem to notice he was making. "This is a family matter," he finally said, too loud, his voice cracking in a way I had never heard. "She has no right to, Mr. Whitman," Judge Alvarez said, not unkindly, but with total finality. "Your sister has every right. What she has is evidence." I sat there holding a folder that had started as nothing but a bad feeling in a parking lot, and I thought about the promise I made my mother back when she was still lucid enough to hold my hand and ask me to protect her. For the first time, I finally understood what that promise had actually been for. Judge Alvarez ruled that same afternoon. The January will was voided for lack of capacity and undue influence. The original will, the one Mr. Halloran drew up 9 years earlier, splitting the estate evenly between Derek and me, was reinstated in full. The clerk read the order twice, like even she couldn't quite believe how cleanly it had gone. Derek didn't look at me on his way out. Vanessa didn't either. I didn't need them to. It has been 8 months. I used my half of the estate to pay off what was left of my divorce debt and put a down payment on a small house 4 blocks from Maya's school. Nothing fancy. Just enough room for the 2 of us, and a garden I'm slowly learning to keep alive, the same way I once learned to keep my mother comfortable. I went back to hospice nursing part-time, though these days I spend almost as much time helping other families understand the kind of paperwork that nearly cost me everything. Derek and I haven't spoken since the hearing. I heard through a cousin that he and Vanessa sold their house in Columbus. I don't know if that's true, and for the first time in a long time, I've realized I don't actually need to know. I kept one thing from my mother's house before any of it was ever listed. A small ceramic dish that used to sit on her nightstand, chipped on one edge, worth nothing to anyone but me. It sits on my nightstand now, Some nights I still expect to hear her calling my name from the next room. I don't think that feeling ever fully goes away, and I've stopped trying to make it. What I know now is this: love doesn't need a witness, and it definitely doesn't need a will to make it real. I showed up for my mother because she was my mother. Everything else, in the end, was just paperwork.